Welcome everybody to another STEM Wednesday. We will get started here. My name is Jonathan Lockwood. I am a STEM training and development specialist with Boxlight, former classroom teacher in the high school and middle school STEM classroom. Today, we're going to talk about how you can utilize the Labdisc in a different setting in any STEM classroom, but specifically looking at environmental science. So just to quickly background to the Labdisc and the Xploris, if you're unfamiliar with the device, the Labdisc is an all-in-one STEM lab. It contains a collection of sensors that allow you to log data, and then you have the ability to visualize that data. There are 4 different versions of the Labdisc. There's a GenSci Labdisc, which has all your most commonly used science sensors, Biochem Labdisc, Physio Labdisc, the environmental science one, which I wanted to feature today. We don't always feature it as much as some of the others, but the Enviro is specifically made and designed to have sensors that you would use in an environmental classroom setting, environmental science classroom setting, rather. So this device has sensors like UV light sensor, pH sensor, barometer and dissolved oxygen, an infrared temperature sensor, humidity and GPS, temperature, both ambient and external temperature, and then a colorimeter and a turbidity sensor as well. So all these sensors are located in the device itself. There's no external pieces that you necessarily need for this device. The other device I'd like to highlight is our newer data sensor device, and it's just more than a data sensor. It has really 3 main areas that it can be used, and we call this a true all-in-one STEAM device. STEAM is becoming much more popular with that art piece that is not being utilized maybe as much in a science classroom, but this is a great device that allows you to integrate that art piece into a STEM setting. The Labdisc Xploris has a science mode, allows you to do data sensing and data logging. It has an engineering piece that allows you to do controls. So it has inputs and outputs. You can control motors and fans and lights and servos. And it has the ability to code those as well using either Blockly or Python. And then there is the art feature. The art feature has a pixel art display. So you can custom create your own pixel art to correspond to different data inputs or outputs. And also a composer where you can create your own songs note by note and have those as a reaction to some of the inputs or outputs of the device. The Labdisc environmental science Labdisc is great for all classrooms. This device, the Xploris, is really focused on that K5 grade level. Because of that, it does have a limited number of sensors. So it only has a light sensor, a distance sensor, a temperature sensor, and a sound level sensor. And with those sensors, it allows really any of those K5 science standards to be covered in an easy to use manner. So let's get into the experiments. And I wanted to talk about these one at a time, just some different examples of how you could use the Labdisc in an environmental science setting. And the first experiment I want to talk about is simulating acid rain. And this can be done with very, very limited supplies. All you need to do this is a beaker of distilled water and a straw. And you'll be using the pH sensor on your device. So whether you have the environmental science Labdisc or the GenSci, you can use that pH sensor. And we're going to be measuring the acidity of the water. And essentially what's happening here is somebody is going to take and blow into that straw for about a minute or so. As they blow into the straw, you're going to be constantly recording the pH of the water, so the acidity or basicness of the water. And we're going to see that over time, the more carbon dioxide, so we exhale carbon dioxide, the more CO2 we exhale into the water, that it actually contributes to the acidity of the water, because that carbon dioxide is becoming dissolved into the water itself. And just a quick time lapse, this is sort of what we might expect to see. So as you start blowing into the water, you're going to start to see the pH of that water start to quickly drop. So there was one dip in this graph, but after that, it starts to move pretty consistently. Right? And with this, you can have discussions with students about how Increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere are contributing to acid rain, and how acid rain impacts different environments and habitats, maybe for animals, or even how it affects different building structures, if we're thinking in an engineering sense. Another really easy to do Labdisc environmental science lesson, or experiment rather, is an experiment of the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is really easy to sort of replicate. Uh, and all you have to do is you place the lab disc inside of a clear, could be a trash bag or a grocery bag or even a Ziploc bag. And you're going to record with the ambient temperature sensor, the temperature inside of that bag. And then as you can see in the diagram here, you're going to take and also record the external temperature, so the temperature outside of the bag. And you're going to take and place that lab disc out in the sun for about 30 minutes or so. And we're going to see that temperature changes inconsistently between the two probes. So inside the bag, which is represented by the blue line, we see that the temperature stays pretty consistent. And then outside of the bag, which is, I'm switching things around. Inside of the bag is represented by the red line. So we see that increase in temperature. And then outside of the bag stays pretty consistent, which is represented by that blue line over that 30-minute time period. A third lesson we can look at is a lesson in microclimates. And I'm going to give a couple different examples of this one. The first one would be using the temperature and humidity sensors. You can also include pressure, but both the GenSci and the Enviro Labdisc have all the sensors you need to do this. And they also have a GPS sensor, which allows you to actually record that data and then plot that data on top of a map like you see here in the picture. And so all you have to do is just take that Labdisc for a walk. And as you walk around, you're going to be recording that temperature and that humidity. And you'll start to notice some unique patterns show up. And when you look at it on a map, you're able to relate those patterns that you're seeing in the data you're collecting to the specific microclimate that you're within. So whether you're walking down a street in a crowded city, or maybe you're taking a walk through a park where you're going through areas of sun and shade, or really dense trees or large grassy fields, you're going to start to notice specific trends in the data that are represented by the temperature and humidity that you're measuring. If you do choose to measure pressure, the pressure allows you to actually measure altitude or relate the altitude level of where you're at in correspondence with the graph. So here's a couple examples of this. So this is a walk through the park, and this is ambient temperature. So we notice that there are some changes. So the darker blue it gets, the colder it is. The closer into the red we get, the warmer it is. And if we were familiar with this area and we were able to sort of see where we were walking, we would notice some trends. So for example, we can see that the person walked along a river, and near that river, we see that it was much colder than when they were walking in an open path. And we can also look at the exact same thing and look at humidity. And we see that humidity is almost exactly inverse. So all the places where in the previous the temperature was sort of at the highest points, humidity is going to be at the lowest point. And this is not necessarily an experiment in microclimate, but just overall climate and sort of Earth's atmosphere. If you want to get really crazy with things, you can actually send your lab disk into near space in a weather balloon. And these are some pictures from a school group that did this. They took and actually connected their lab disk to a weather balloon. They included a phone in along with the lab disk. They used the phone's basically like find my iPhone feature to find the lab disk after the balloon pops and it falls back to Earth. But the entire time that lab disk was recording all sorts of data. It recorded sound level, it recorded temperature, it recorded atmospheric pressure, and even altitude. And the students who did this, they were able to see unique points in that lab disk's sort of journey. from where it was first launched to where the balloon popped and where the lab disk started to fall back to Earth, and when it was retrieved. And that journey lasted about 2 hours or so. And in some cases, it actually, some of the data that was collected met the limitations of the sensors, specifically with pressure and temperature. Um, the limit of the sensor for temperature limited out at it looks like negative 40 degrees Celsius. And then that pressure sensor also reached a limit at some point as well. So some additional ideas that you can think about using your lab disk for in an environmental science classroom setting is doing an experiment in photosynthesis. So measuring air pressure inside a enclosed container. So if you place a plant in there, you can see how the plant fluctuates, or the air pressure within that vessel fluctuates as the plant goes through the process of photosynthesis. You can look at heat absorption by different materials. So when we're thinking about building and creating environmentally friendly buildings or different structures, we can look at things like the heat absorption of different color paints that we might paint a house with, or the reflection of heat energy by those using the temperature sensors or the infrared thermometer. As I showed with the weather balloon, doing experiments regarding altitude and air pressure, so using the barometer, using the GPS. Water quality is a huge thing in an environmental science classroom. So looking at some of the big key determining factors of water quality, which are turbidity. So turbidity is the amount of particulate suspended in water. And then dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen tells us how likely that water might be to grow different plant life, like algae or things like that. And then weather tracking. With younger grade levels, there's a lot of standards all around the weather. And weather tracking is a huge thing that you can do with Labdisc, where you can track weather over large periods of time, over an entire day or over an entire week, and have students start to learn patterns in the weather and be able to have discussions about different types of weather, whether it's a cloudy day or sunny day or humid or dry. We can relate those things to numerical data with the Labdisc. So if you are new to Boxlight, we host these webinars weekly. So every Wednesday we host them. We have a whole suite of educational technology that we provide to the classroom. I encourage you to take a look at boxlight.com if you're interested in seeing more about any of these different areas that can support your classroom in. And as we approach next week is Thanksgiving. So next week we will have no STEM Wednesday. I'm sure almost all of you are off for the week from school. So enjoy your break. When we come back from that, we will have 2 sessions in December. And in December, we will start out with Tinkercad lesson, creating a holiday tree using code blocks. That'll be with Hannah. And then I will wrap up the last STEM Wednesday of 2024, talking about some kitchen chemistry with the Labdisc. So how we can use the Labdisc in a not what you would think of as a not direct STEM setting, but thinking about how we can maybe take the Labdisc home over winter break, and while you're making your Christmas cookies, you can use it. All of the STEM Wednesdays will take place at the exact same time, so 4:30 Eastern. And we'll release a schedule for STEM Wednesdays in January, but the first one will resume back on January 8th. So I will stick around for just a couple minutes if we have any questions in the chat. Otherwise, I appreciate all of you for joining today, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving with your friends and family.